Hi, and welcome to It's Not Your Fault. I'm your host, Kim Power-Stilson, with Steve Shenk, the author of It's Not Your Fault. Now, we're here today to talk about not just the book and on the solutions that your book offers. You are everywhere. We see you all over Facebook. You're online. We hear on national radio shows from all over the country. Steve Shenk is a buzzword. People are wanting more Steve Shenkisms. If you watch this series, you know what those are. You can check it out on Facebook. But they want to know about Steve. Steve, the author. Steve, the entrepreneur. Steve, the person who's provided a solution to the worldwide need for food. Steve, who are you? Where were you born? How did this all start?
Goodness. I was born a long time ago up in Anoka, Minnesota with the Shades and Norwegians, and raised on a farm. It was what my dad referred to as a diversified farm. He was from Iowa, and his daddy was a 49er, so we skipped a generation or so. His father came over straight from Germany and rode a little black stallion all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast for stock for Horace Greeley, and panned enough gold to come back and buy a farm in Iowa, bring his parents over from Germany, and ultimately my dad left that farm, went up and bought a farm in Minnesota, and had 3 kids by his first wife who died, and then my mom was about 40 years younger than he was, and so he was 62 when I was born, and I was the taillight of the family, and so all of my brothers and sisters.
How many total?
There were 5 of them, and then 1 of me.
Okay.
So that makes a total of 6 kids in case. But anyway, it was.
I didn't know if your mom had extra after you, but you were the taillight. So.
No, I was the absolute taillight. Probably, I was either the frosting on the cake or the reason that they never even thought about having any more kids.
I would imagine the latter.
Well, with 62 and 42, that's probably about as good as it's going to get.
Yes, yes.
So anyway. So
your family actually immigrated here from Germany. How about your mom's side of the family?
My mom used to refer to herself as Heinz 57. My grandfather was an old woodsman, but he also worked for the railroads, and he was living out in Graston, Minnesota, which was really wilderness at the time, and my grandmother would drive the horse and buggy down to pick him up when he came in from a railroad run, and the guy was a phenomenal athlete. Back then, they didn't have the Olympics. Both sides of the family are way back. But anyway, he'd be doing handsprings on top of the railroad cars when they were pulling into the station, and the man was able to walk on his hands on a picket fence. I mean, this is the caliber of people they were. My grandmother was just a little bitty bugger, and back then the Chippewa Indians that was where they kind of resided.
And this is the late 1800s, early?
Yeah.
Before you came along, obviously.
Yeah, it was significantly before I came along.
So, but your grandparents' time, okay.
Yeah, and so she'd always feed the Indians, but they were kind of scared to come in to their log cabin. They'd always stand at the edge of the clearing and yell at her and yaloo at her, and she'd come out and put away the bear, because my grandfather brought home a bear cub, and the only one that could control the bear was my little bitty. I think she was under 5 feet tall, and the bear would get out of hand. She'd swat the daylights out of him with a broom, and he'd get up on the roof and squall and holler. And
she had a real live bear, not a dog or a cat.
Yeah, no, she just had a bear, and but that was kind of the way she was. But the Indians would yell from the side of the clearing, and she'd put the chain on the bear, and then they'd come in and she'd feed him.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Now you have not a bear, but a beautiful dog. This is Lexi, your dog.
Yeah, well, she's the director of the show, actually, and you can tell the show's going very well because the director is totally out of it.
All right, so Steve, this show, it's called It's Not Your Fault, for those of you just tuning in, and it's based on your book, which is based on some characters that we're going to talk about in another show. But for today, we're going to talk about what everyone's hearing about, and we want to get to know the Steve Shenk. So we know a little bit about you and your being born. Now, when and your ancestry. What about your childhood? What was that like growing up in Minnesota?
Pretty ordinary. I was a farm kid, so By the time I got to grade school, all the other kids in town had, learned to play baseball and basketball and football together, and so I always had to try and catch up. And so when I wanted to play baseball, and my dad went down to Sears Roebuck in Minneapolis and bought me a rubber baseball. If you've ever smelled a rubber baseball, if you're driving in a car for 20 miles to get from Minneapolis down to the farm, and you got that rubber baseball, it makes you sick. But anyway, I'd take that baseball, and for a pop fly, I'd throw it up against the side of the barn and pop up and throw it straight on, and it would give me a grounder. And so maybe I could catch up and play halfway as good as the other kids, and at least keep my self-image intact, which is where I first started learning about the law of me. Which
this is a principle in your book.
Everything that we do is based on how that makes us feel about ourselves. If I'm nice to you, I'm nice to you because I want to be seen by you as being a nice person. If I'm a stinker and I don't care, then I'm not nice.
And you learned that from throwing a
baseball against the barn. I guess maybe, because my big thing was to try and keep up and not embarrass myself.
At school, when all the other kids are playing sports, and you also had your farming.
Yeah, when they had that advantage. Now I could vault a 6-foot fence, and in 3rd grade it was kind of interesting because the 3rd grade teacher got a hold of my mom and said, "Well, we're really concerned about Steve's vocabulary." And she said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, look at his test scores." Well, you got to understand, back in those days, they made out the tests based on an urban vocabulary. And you see, I was in 3rd grade, and I knew what a coulter was. I knew what a hamestrap was. I knew what a doubletree was. I knew a lot of stuff, but these are all, a hamestrap is on a harness, a coulter is on a plow. A doubletree is what you hook the horses up to pull a wagon. And as it turns out, I probably have a fairly significant vocabulary, but my vocabulary was rural back then, and so I was.
So compared to the urban,
they thought I was kind of a dunce. But a lot of people still think I'm kind of a dunce, but that's okay.
Well, and people love hearing you speak, and they come to your conferences, and like I said, we've heard you on national radio and seen you on the national TV. So let's talk then about It's Not Your Fault. When did this idea for this book start? Did it start as early as you being a child? Did your folks know you would be a writer?
No, it developed over a lot of years of trying to figure out how things to work. I lived my life a great deal by default. When I graduated with my master's degree from college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do yet, and I kind of still don't. But
you do everything.
So I ended up in sales, and there are 2 kinds of psychology. My sister is in Who's Who in Women in Education in America right now. She was a school psychologist, but she was a clinical psychologist. The difference between a clinical psychologist and an applied psychologist is a clinical psychologist, they get paid whether they're right or not. Applied psychologist, which is a salesman, starves if he doesn't figure out how it works. And so I took that route, and it became very interesting to figure out how people work, what makes things happen. I had to figure out what people resonated to about a product, how they felt, and in the process of just trying to make my living in sales, I had to get basically inside people's heads, feel how they were feeling. And one of the principles, there's a difference between a salesman and a con man, for example. A salesman and a con man both know how to relate to people. They can get them to think as they think, see as they see, feel as they feel, and act as they want them to act. But the con man gets them to act in the light of his own self-betterment, and the salesman gets them to act in the light of their own self-betterment. Because in every sales situation, the salesman always knows much more about his product than what he shares with the person. But if he told them everything, there was a young preacher that got assigned to a new parish, and he went out there 2 weeks ahead of time because this was his first congregation, and he wanted to get ready for him. And so he started preparing a sermon and everything. And the Sabbath came, and at 9 o'clock in the morning, he got into his garb, and he went up, and he sat behind the podium on his preacher's chair, and he waited. He waited 15 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, and it was just about an hour, and all of a sudden he heard the sound of footsteps coming in the foyer, and there was this clomp, clomp, clomp. An old farmer came in, and we still had his farm duds on. He wasn't dressed up, and he walked up to the front and came around, sat in the front pew, and just kind of crossed his arms and waited. And the young fellow figured, well, if this is all of the flock I got, I'm still going to preach the sermon. So he got up and he preached, and he preached, and he preached, and he preached. He held forth for about an hour and a half. And then they had the benediction and the prayer, and he scurried back to the back to greet his congregation as they came out, and he just couldn't resist himself. And he said, well, sir, what do you think? And the old farmer says, well, Reverend, I got a bunch of cows. And when I take a load of hay out to feed the cows out in the pasture, and only one cow shows up, I don't dump the whole load. and so that's what I had to avoid when I was in sales and trying to work with people, giving them enough so that they could make a wise decision. And I discovered a lot of these basic principles, some of them as a result of starvation, some of them as a result of just figuring out how people responded.
So these principles that we're speaking of are principles that are in your book, and there is a way they're delivered that's very well done. I mean, it's like nothing you've read before. It's not a self-help. It doesn't actually fit into those kind of categories. It's really a book about finding the magnificence in you through someone else's eyes and the guardian that comes to them. So we're going to talk about that, but first we're going to talk on this show more about Steve Shenk. We're going to take just a brief break, and when we come back, we're going to find out what happened in those years of sales and then some of the tough stuff that you faced in your life and overcame that helped you become the Steve Shenk that we know and love. We'll be right back.
Folks, have you ever realized that freedom is spelled F-O-O-D? Food. After air and water, food is our greatest dependency. Taking control of that dependency ensures personal power, independence, and freedom. We can't control earthquakes, storms, martial law, dollar crash inflation, the global warming hoax, farm and garden restrictive legislation, job loss, crop failures, or the 2012 planet disruptions. However, if we have our own food, none of these can control us. Hunger can never be used to control you if you never are forced to stand in a bread line because you do not have your own bread. It seems the only freedom we still have control of is possession of food. If we don't control our own food, events are rapidly moving to use food to control us. Freedom truly is spelled F-O-O-D. Contact efoodsdirect.com or call 800-409-5633. That's efoodsdirect.com or 800-409-5633.
And welcome back to It's Not Your Fault. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before the break, we were talking with Steve Shenk, who is the author of the book and the reason we're doing this weekly TV show. And we're so glad, again, that you've joined us. Now, you've heard about Steve everywhere. He's all over Facebook. Maybe you've heard him on the national radio shows that have been everywhere. Steve and his company have provided a solution to the world's hunger, the nation's hunger problem, in the form of this wonderful food. And so we thank them for sponsoring us. But today we're talking about not just the book, not just about the conferences, and about the solution that Steve's provided that goes beyond food, but goes right into the hearts of people and finds their magnificence, and it allows them to survive through any kind of conflict or dependency. This book is unusual, it's amazing, it's changed my life, so I'm honored to be here with Steve Shenk, the author. And over the next few weeks, over this series, we're going to talk about each of the principles in your book and how those interactions could help each of you. So you're not going to want to miss one of those. But today we're talking about you and getting to know the person who wrote this marvelous book and who shared these principles in It's Not Your Fault. So before the break, we were talking about you being a salesperson, and you shared that great story. Tell us more about your life once you figured out how to sell so well and how you provided the solution. Tell us more about your life and how it applied to writing this book.
Well, at one time we were working up in Frankfort, Indiana, and I was doing so poorly. Well, you got to understand, folks, that I was selling pre-need cemetery property.
Hard to sell.
That's mausoleums and lawn crypts and plots. I think I've spent a good share of my life in sales selling stuff that nobody really in their right mind would want, but yet has tremendous value for them. But and we were starving. This was the time at which our ability to buy groceries was readily challenged, and keeping cars from being repossessed and that type of thing. And at one point in time, Sherry was a fascinating sweetheart of mine. I had been I was married to her for 33 years before she passed away, but she was probably better at doing what I needed to learn to do than I was. But at one point in time, she says, "Okay, that does it. I'm going to ride with you." And I remember this one.
On your sales route.
Yeah, well, yeah. What we'd do is, it was quite a ways away, so we'd drive up early in the morning, and about 9 o'clock in the morning, I'd go out and start knocking. I was working in a rural area outside of Frankfurt, because at that point the story is that all of the leads to sell cemetery property had been burned out because the gals that were calling for people to make appointments had gone through the phone book 3 times in 6 months. I mean, it's just, people were starting to say, "Don't answer the phone, it might be them."
Yeah.
And so anyway, so I did it the hard way. But we'd go out and knock on doors, make some appointments for that evening, and then go to a park, buy a pizza from Pizza Hut or some Kentucky Fried Chicken, have our lunch, and we had one of these little Pintos with a flat back on the back of it.
Yes, those.
And we'd take, when it was cooler weather, we'd take a pillow and a blanket, and we'd just take a little nap. Because you got to understand, if you start at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're going through, by the time you get to 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night and you're starting your appointments, you're beat to death, so you need some rest. And so we'd take a little nap, get up and comb our hair, and I was so bad at, most young salesmen will try and, they feel if they're any good, they should be able to sell everybody. No, what she taught me was, honey, what you're looking for are the right people at the right time that want, need, and appreciate what you have. And I say, well, I can't tell. If I can get in the house and do a presentation, I ought to be able to sell. She says, no, I'm going to come in with you. And so we developed this little system where I'd sit there and I'd start the presentation, and if she'd get a sense at all that they were just kind of never going to come to it, she'd just tap me on the foot. You know, she'd hit my foot with her foot.
So it was like your cue to move on.
And I'd say, well, it's been nice meeting you. Go back to watching your basketball game, and, you know, we'll talk to you some other time. And we'd leave. Because here's what she taught me. It's better to pull the trigger and get out of there when you could have possibly made the sale and maintain your self-respect than it is to go in there and take a loss. It's just like a boxer. A boxer, they got a young kid that's, you know, pretty good, and they're training him and stuff. When he has his first fight, they don't match him up with the heavyweight champion of the world. They match him up with some guys that they know he can beat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of cruel, but that's what they do. And it's the same way. So I discovered it's better to pull the trigger a little too soon than too late and take the beating on your self-image. because your self-confidence is what you have to work with. But anyway, we were out one time, and there's a principle that I deal with every day in my companies, and that is the fact that there's a difference between doing all you can if you've got a job or a task that you're trying to do, and doing whatever it takes. And that's the difference between someone who will never be truly successful and someone who will. And where I learned that was one night she was riding with me, and she'd come down with the stomach flu. And she was in the back of this, and it was a chilly night, and so she was bundled up in a blanket and had her head on the pillow, and I got to be about 9:30. Now 9:30 in sales, most people won't go into a house at that time. That's the best time you go, because the kids are in bed, and you always set a 9:30 appointment, always, okay? And so anyway, it was 9:30, and I'd gone through a couple of my lead cards, and I said, well, nobody's home, and let's just bag it for the night. I remember she got up, and she was just so sick. She was a beautiful girl, and she was just, she poked her head up over the seat and says, "One more," and then plunk, laid down. Oh. And I went down to this little farmhouse, and it had 2 holes in the porch that I had to step over, and it was really rickety. And when I knocked on the door, I'd talked to the people earlier, and I'd kind of discounted this as not being, one I'd even go back to. When I knocked on the door, the glass had no caulking in it, and it just rattled. And when I stopped by before, I saw that there was a little fan that went tick, 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 that was hung by a coat hanger up in the archway, bringing the heat from an oil stove in from the living room into the kitchen.
It's a pretty destitute circumstance.
So it was really, and there's farm machinery, old farm machinery and stuff all over the yard. So I went up and knocked on the door, and I went in and I made a sale. These people chose to get some property. And he gave me his 5 brothers, okay, as referrals. That week, I went to each one of those brothers, and I learned the value of referrals, and I learned the fact that you don't just do all you can, you do whatever it takes. And those principles and the value of referrals, from then on, anytime I taught sales organizations and everything, I taught about referrals, and you have to pull teeth and beat them with a stick to get salesmen to go after referrals, because they're so worried that the sale is going to fall through that they grab the money and run.
Yeah.
Stupid, but anyway, and that was my first $1,000 week, and I got a big old ring that just, when you put it on your finger, it just turns your hand over.
And you attribute this to your wife saying, "One more."
Well, yeah, and in fact, during during that same period of time, that was the breaking point. About a week before that, I had been, just really exasperated. I was speaking German. The King's English, as my dad used to call it, all the way down from Frankfurt down to where we lived, and I was saying the market is no good, the people are no good, the company's no good, everything is no good. And she said, "Shut blank up." And I stopped, and she was rather a quiet little gal, and I stopped, and she said, Decide whether you're going to be a salesman or you're not."
And would you say that was a pivotal place?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Because the most important thing in any creation, and this is what you're going to learn from the book and from these conferences, the most important thing you can do, which seals the absolute creation of anything you choose to do, is for you to decide. And the one thing that Sherry would absolutely kill me over, and just really get pouty, snotty, mad at me, is after I made a decision, if I said, "Well, now wait a minute, now if I try to undecide." You see, the decision, you will learn as you work with us, the decision is the creation. And if you don't do something stupid like undecide by saying, "Well, I don't know if I can do this, I don't know if I should do this, and I don't know if I can do this," all this kind of stuff. If you create and then you uncreate. The difference between people who are successful is that they create just a little bit more than they uncreate because they decide and they don't undecide just as much. And that's what my sweetheart taught me.
Steve, that is a beautiful story, and we hope you watching will decide to tune into this show, It's Not Your Fault, every week. You can find Steve on Facebook. You can find It's Not Your Fault online. You've probably seen Steve everywhere, but we'd like to invite you to join us here. Decide, please, to join us here every week. This has been the It's Not Your Fault show. This is Steve Shenk again. Kim Power Stilson, thanks for joining us.